we should be on the lake, of course.
What was that, Tom?
We should be on the lake.
I know, it's just Wi-Fi connectivity issues and also laptop in canoe.
Oh yeah, all of that.
It's like we got about 42 people on right now. Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Eggert. I'm with the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters, and we're here today to talk fishing. We got a couple other people. I'm going to let them introduce themselves as we let everyone just join our webinar here. Take it away, Tom.
Well, thank you, Lauren, and thanks everybody for joining us. Delighted to have you here today. Also happy to welcome Lauren, who's going to be one of our speakers, as well as Sam Bogan, who's next to me. This is really an emphasis on beginning guide to boundary waters. I'm not going to profess to be an experienced or professional angler, but I have fished for quite some time in the boundary waters, and have some modest success. My friends would argue with that, but I think I've learned enough things over the years that at least I can talk to the very beginner. So if you're looking for the secret tips to how the pros do it, you got the wrong show. If you're looking for just basics about how to fish in boundary waters, this is the right place. So please hang on, and we'll get started. Next slide, please. So we are delighted again to have Sam and Lauren, in addition to myself, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit. I know Sam. He happens to be dating my daughter, which is a very precarious thing for any young man. But Sam has been a lifelong angler, loves fishing, and took his first trip to the boundary waters last year.
Yes, yeah. So I'm Sam, as has been stated, but yeah, last May was my first time ever going to the boundary waters, and it had always been something I always wanted to do. So I'm excited to be here today.
And Lauren's been a lifelong angler as well.
Well, lifelong being went fishing with my dad growing up, and yeah, he always went on these fishing trips with guys, and I would always beg to go with, and of course, that's super against the rules. Girls aren't allowed on guy trips. So he started taking me and my sister up to Lake Vermilion in addition to his fishing trips to take us out fishing. And that photo of me there is actually on Lake Vermilion. And yeah, I dig it. I'm definitely no expert, but I love it. It's fun and it's delicious.
And so I think Sam and Lauren will be able to add commentary here from the standpoint of essentially a beginner, and let us know, what their impressions are, what they like about it, what they like to fish for, and tips they might share. So thank you guys for being with us today. And so I'm the executive director of the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters, Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness. Really been fishing up in the Superior and in the boundary waters since about 1971. So spent a fair amount of time up there. Most of my fishing is for walleyes. I'll talk a little bit about smallmouth, northerns, and lake trout as well. But the emphasis on this is going to be walleyes for beginners in the boundary waters. So next slide, please. So the first question you might ask is, why fish the BWCA? Why fish in the boundary waters at all? And I'm going to ask Lauren. Lauren, why would you fish in the boundary waters?
Well, I feel like it would, you want to eat good. It's like you don't want just dehydrated meals or lugging a cooler around full of meat. You want fresh fish. It's delicious.
Fresh fish, very good. Yeah, and Sam.
It's funny. I read the question, and like for me, it's like it took me a second because I'm like, why go to the boundary waters if you're not going to fish? It's as you see, as it says, blue ribbon fishing. Seriously, some of the best fishing in North America, probably. So. Just why not, really?
Well, and I guess I'm always a little bit amazed when I see people up in the boundary waters and they don't have fishing rods. And I think, okay, well, what do you do all day? I mean, you can paddle and you can look and you can eat and stuff like that, but fishing is fun. It's a fun thing to do when you're up there. So yeah, so the answers are many, obviously, to why fish boundary waters. One is there's just tons of opportunity. Everywhere you are in the boundary waters, assuming you're in a canoe, you are going to be near water, near fish. It is truly blue ribbon fishing. It's some of the best in North America, certainly the best in Minnesota. More than 1,200 lakes, miles and miles of rivers. Most of those areas are very lightly fished, with the exception of the lakes that are real close to the access points. So the fish are not very smart, and they can be fairly abundant. A lot of different species, all of which are very fun. We'll talk about 4 in particular. And you have a good chance of both getting large fish for these species as well as numbers of fish for the species. So really is a great place to fish. I usually try to make 2 trips in the spring when the walleyes are most active, because that's the best time of year for me to catch fish. So the Boundary Waters, one of the best places to go, and lots of opportunity. Next slide, please. It's also a good way to spend time, as Sam was mentioning. What are you going to do up there? And it's a great way to spend your day. We oftentimes base camp. We'll go into a place and stay there for several days and fish. You can fish anytime, both daily and seasonally. People go up there in the winter and they fish through the ice, but you can fish, spring, summer, fall, morning, noon, and night. So it's always available to you. And it's always different. Every lake is different. Every fish is different. And each one can give you a different sort of experience and a lot of fun. And virtually all of the fish that you would catch in Minnesota in the Boundary Waters are edible. They're as Lauren says, they make for a great meal, and they make for a great shore lunch. We'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. Next slide, please. But another really important one, and I think this is especially for you parents, get your kids up there. I started taking my kids when they were 5 and 6 into the Boundary Waters, day tripping and ultimately longer trips. And they love fishing. They love catching fish. For kids, what's really important is not that they catch big fish, but that they catch a lot of fish. And that's a great place to go catch a lot of fish relatively easy. Notwithstanding that the chance to catch a big fish is very possible. So you might create some real memories for your kids, and something they'll never forget. Bring a camera, because your kids will remember this for the rest of their lives. So let's talk a little bit about the fish to catch. As I mentioned, there's a lot of different species up there. People tend to target 4 specific species. We'll talk about each of those a little bit. But before we do, let me ask Lauren, what's your favorite fish to catch?
For sure, walleye. It's the best. It's my favorite to eat. So I love the cheek meat. I love getting a nice big walleye that you can carve out the cheek meat, and that's the delicacy for me.
There you go. Walleye cheeks. And Sam, what's your favorite?
I grew up fishing in Illinois, and so there's not many fish there, but largemouth bass, and so I'm a big bass fisherman, and smallmouth bass are like the superior version of largemouth bass because they fight harder. I feel like they're more fun to fish for. I don't know. So smallmouth bass.
Smallmouth. There you go. Well, I'm a walleye guy myself for the most part, just because I like to eat fish. But next slide, please. But this is the fish that Sam is talking about. This is a smallmouth bass. This happens to be my daughter, Sam's girlfriend. And this is a bass she caught last year, a smallmouth she caught last year. Very, very nice fish. That was 18, 20 inches. I think,
close
Sam.
to 5 pounds.
It was a really nice fish. And you can see the smile on her face. That is the reaction you get when you get something like this. So smallmouth, fairly common in the Boundary Waters. They are amazing fighters. They will jump, they will pull. If you catch a bass on the wrong line, you are likely to lose it because they will break your line. Tend to be in shallower water, usually less than 10 feet deep. They're really aggressive. They'll take virtually any bait. What's really fun is topwater baits that float on the top, and we'll show you one of those later on. But when you're fishing with a topwater, the bass will come right out of the water and jump and take them. It's just very, very exciting. It can happen right next to the boat, and it jangles you a little bit.
It'll scare you. Yeah, keep you on your toes.
They aren't the best eating relative to, say, walleyes or northern, but they can be good, especially in the cooler weather like spring and fall. So we've eaten them before. Most people, I think, arguably fish for bass just for the experience of catching them and releasing them. And I should mention for bass, as well as all of these other species, there are specific regulations for each lake, for each species. And so you should check the Minnesota DNR's website, mndnr.gov, for the specific regulations for smallmouth bass on the particular lake that you're going to. Lauren, how do you like fishing for smallmouth?
I like bass fishing. It's fun. I don't catch a lot of smallmouth. I find it, I guess, a little bit more challenging, but I think my knowledge base is more in walleye. But I know they like underwater reefs. Is that right? You'll
often find smallmouth in 4 to 6 feet of water, at least in the spring. And one little trick that I use when I do want to catch smallmouth is, there's a lot of crayfish in the boundary waters, a lot of rocks, a lot of crayfish. If you go catch a couple crayfish, put them on a hook and a bobber and cast it out there, it's dynamite for smallmouth. I'll just take those day and night, and you get some nice fish that way as well. So there's always bait there because there's crayfish and they're really good for smallmouth. Next slide, please. So now we are talking about the state fish of the state of Minnesota, and that is walleye. And everybody knows about walleye. They are arguably one of the best eating fish in Minnesota. They're fun to catch. They aren't as aggressive as, say, a bass or a northern, but they do put up a good fight. They tend to hang on the bottoms of the lakes. So when you think about where you're fishing with walleye, you're almost always on the bottom of the lake. In spring, this time of year for the next month or so, I look in 5 to 15 feet of water and use a jig with a leech right on the bottom because that's where the fish are going to be. They're called walleyes. They have special eyes, and if you shine a light on them, you'll see them glow because they prefer low light conditions. So they're most active early in the morning, later in the afternoon, or even into the night. People catch big fish late at night and typically closer to shore. The boundary waters is a great spot for walleyes. And in fact, the state record walleye, which I believe was about 17 pounds, came out of Seagull River, which is just adjacent to the boundary waters up on the end of the Gunflint. So really, really big fish up there. The biggest walleye I've ever caught was below Basswood Falls many years ago, and that was a nice 30-inch fish. So wonderful fish. Again, check the rules for limits and dates and so on. Walleye opener is in a week, and so there will be a lot of people converging up there for walleyes. And so, Lauren, you love walleyes. You love walleyes. Where do you go for walleyes?
I mean, Lake Vermilion. It's the lake that I know. I know the west end like the back of my hand. Just about any spot, any kind of fish you want, I can put you on Lake Vermilion. Now the boundary waters is different, right? Because every lake is different. So I'm trying to figure out, and hopefully you can help us through this webinar, of how to find fish on a body of water that you've never fished before.
There you go.
I know we're getting to that.
And a jig and a leech.
And a jig, yes. I do like a Lindy rig. I like a jig and a leech. That's pretty much all that's in my little tackle box here. Live bait, I'm always up for the leeches. Used to freak me out as a kid. Now, no problem. They not at all. So I would say get your kids out fishing as soon as possible so they can get used to the sliminess that comes with fishing. It takes a while to get over. It did for me, but now it doesn't bother me.
There you go. Very good. And Sam, you and Hunter went to Echo Lake last year. What did you find worked on walleyes there?
Like you said, a jig and a leech. I think that's the only thing I've really had success on walleye fishing my whole life is live bait. Jig and a minnow, jig and a leech, or sometimes a jig and a night crawler. But yeah, live bait is the way to go. And like you said, I always drop down to the bottom, reel up, right, like 6 inches, and then just wait. Just bounce it.
Walleye can be pretty finicky, so sometimes it takes a little finesse to learn when you've got a hit on there. But springtime of the year in particular, they can be very aggressive and relatively easy to catch relative to the rest of the time of year. Again, check the rules. Next slide. So a lot of people want size. They want a big fish, and the northern pike is the biggest fish that you'll typically catch in the boundary waters. You can get big lake trout as well, but northern pike are certainly the most abundant of the game species that can get fairly large. Northerns have a mouthful of teeth. Walleyes do too, but northerns really are notable, and they've got a larger mouth. And so you always have to be very careful with northerns when you take the hook out that you don't get your fingers in there, because you will slice open your finger. You also need to use a steel leader on the end of your line, or otherwise the northern will break it. If you're fishing without a leader for walleye, say, and you get a fish and all of a sudden the line parts, more often than not, it means a northern took your bait and just bit your line. They're very aggressive. They will take anything, anytime, anywhere. It's not uncommon to be fishing for walleyes, catch a walleye, reel it in, and have a northern come and slam the walleye and try to take it from you. And I've had northerns come and try to take fish off of a stringer. They're very, very aggressive, which is what makes them so much fun. They're fun to catch because they're very strong. They'll make long runs. They'll leap every now and then. And again, they can get very big. So quite a bit of fun. They tend to be in shallower water. I'd say less than 15 feet, at least my experience. They're a predator fish, so they're up there looking for small bait fish to eat. And so the shallow water, especially by weeds, is where you'll tend to find that. Northerns have kind of a bum rap because they have what's called Y bones in the meat. So they're little bitty bones that split off from the rib bones. And if you don't fillet them properly, you'll get those little Y bones in the fillet, and people get turned off when they get those little bones. There are some really unique ways of cleaning northern, so you'll avoid those Y bones. And we've got some YouTube links at the end that'll show you how to do that. Big fish, big bait, they'll take big top waters, they'll take big spoons. The bigger the bait, the bigger the fish, they say, and that's especially true with northern. So who's got a good northern story?
Go ahead, Sam.
Last time we went to the Boundary Waters, when Hunter and I went to Echo, we were fishing for walleye, and I hooked into a little, 18-inch northern. And when it got in the boat, it cut the line, but it was already in the boat. And so now I have a 18-inch northern at my feet, and of course I'm barefoot, and it's got 6 treble hooks in its mouth because I happened to be casting at that point with a lipless crankbait. And it, in the 2 minutes it took to get it out of the boat, it absolutely shredded my 2 ankles with this treble hooks and its teeth and everything else. And it was chaos. Hunter thought we were going to capsize because he was screaming. It was chaos.
Be careful with northerns. Lauren, you were going to say.
Well, I was going to say, I usually accidentally catch pike. I don't usually really go pike fishing, northern pike fishing. But I have gone muskie fishing, which you can't catch in the Boundary Waters. And I think my story there is I had been casting, they say 10,000 casts per muskie. You cast, you're casting for an hour or more. And I just took a break, and a friend of mine asked, hey, can I cast while you're taking a break and use your rod? I said, sure. And as soon as I think it was like 3 casts in, bam, there's a hit, and reeled in a muskie. And so I was pretty upset about that because I'd been working the fish. Muskie are really territorial, and I'd been working that fish.
It's like a slot machine. You got it all the way up to the 3 cherries, and then the next person pulled it, right?
Exactly. But it was still fun to get a fish in the boat, but it would have been more fun if I had caught it. So we do have a question though about using steel leaders. Someone's asking with walleye or northerns. I know like typically it's just northerns. Is there any reason you'd use one for walleye?
I don't think so. Part of it is how the fish grabs the bait. And in my experience, walleyes grab the bait with the end of their mouth. And so if you catch one on a jig and a leech, the ball of the jig will be outside the fish's mouth and the hook will be inside the fish's mouth. So their teeth never come in contact with the line. Now that's not always true, but especially with artificials, they tend to bite the end of the lure rather than inhale the lure. Northerns, on the other hand, they seem to engulf it, and they've got a bigger mouth. They open wider, and so there's more likelihood that the line is going to come in contact with the teeth. Now, in both cases, when you use, say, a minnow on a bobber, minnow on a hook on a bobber, or a worm on a hook on a bobber, when you're using live bait like that, it's not uncommon for the fish to inhale the whole bait, and so you will have the string, the line coming in contact with the teeth. So in those cases, you might want to think of a leader, but I've never really had a problem with walleyes biting off.
And then someone else wants to know if earthworms, are they invasive to the Boundary Waters?
Earthworms are invasive. You haven't heard me mentioning earthworms. They are not native to Minnesota, and in fact, they do some really damaging things to the topsoil in a pristine environment like the Boundary Waters. Essentially, they eat the organic material and they can destroy the topsoil layer. So it's not recommended that you use earthworms or night crawlers in the Boundary Waters. Leeches, no similar problem. If you're going to bring any kind of live bait, you need to make sure that you're not bringing water from another lake. Aquatic invasive species, big problem in Minnesota, not so much of a problem yet in the Boundary Waters. But if you were to bring in minnows, for instance, you cannot take water out of the lake and put it in your minnow bucket and then move to another lake. You can only use the water that you get from the bait shop. So For many reasons, I think the leech is the best bait there is, especially for walleyes. Otherwise, preserved minnows, freeze-dried minnows, sometimes salted minnows, are a good way to bring in bait as well. And then you're not carrying all that water around with you.
And Tom, someone else wants to know, that photo we saw earlier, the gentleman holding the walleye, there was a fly rod in there.
Yes.
Can you talk about fly fishing for walleye or just in the boundary waters?
You bet. So really, because this is for beginners, I'm coming in with the easiest approach, and spinning rod is the easiest approach. You can also use a bait casting rod, which is good for casting heavier lures, especially for, say, northerns. And a lot of people like using a fly rod. A fly rod is different from a spinning rod in that with a fly rod, you're using a little bitty fly at the end of your line. It doesn't have any weight. When you think of a regular casting motion, you're casting a heavy weight, and so the weight of the lure pulls the line out. But with fly fishing, you're fishing with a little bitty fly. It doesn't have any weight, so you use a heavy line. So fly line is heavy. It's thick plastic, and the weight of the line casts it out like you would do if you were snapping a whip. It's a very fun way of fishing. Fly fishing is a very fun way of fishing. Sam and I are heading to the river later today, and we'll be fly fishing for trout, but it's very much more challenging as well. Walleyes tend to be a bottom water fish, and flies tend to be very close to the surface. Even if you're using a sinking fly, it typically doesn't go down very deep unless you're using a sinking line. So it's much more specialized, and I would certainly say it's a lot of fun. I think top water fishing for smallmouth with a fly rod is about the most fun you can ever have. But I'm sticking to spinning in this discussion just because it's far easier for people to pick up. But happy to talk about more at the end too as well. So
Yeah,
next,
there's a couple more questions, but we'll get to them. So just sit tight if you have questions in there.
so the other main game fish in the boundary waters is lake trout. And a lake trout is what I would call a bucket list fish because they are not very common. There's only a handful of lakes in the boundary waters, relative handful of lakes in the boundary waters that hold lake trout. They require very deep, very cool water, and not a whole lot of lakes in Minnesota or in the boundary waters actually support that kind of habitat. So they're great eating. They're wonderful fish to eat, and the size that person was holding up there is probably about as big as you'd want to keep. If you are interested specifically in looking for trout, then you need to know which lakes have trout. We'll talk a little bit about identifying those in a bit. They're related, of course, to brook trout, brown trout, and a hybrid called splake. Splake are also found in some places in the boundary waters. Fun fish to catch, very, very deep, and you're typically trolling a small jig or a small spoon, I should say, probably in 40, 50 feet of water. So a lot of fun, but not very common, and you got to be a little bit of a specialist to go after lake trout.
And Tom, you told me a fun fact one time about the DNR stalking lake trout.
Many people don't realize this, but lake trout, they're native to Minnesota, but because they're so rare and because their productivity is so low, many of the lakes in the boundary waters are actually stocked with lake trout by the Department of Natural Resources, and they'll fly in and they'll drop fingerlings into a lake every few years just to sustain that population. So yes, it is one of the few things that is stocked in the boundary waters, and without that, we probably would not see the kind of populations we do up there.
Yeah, Sam or Tom, have either of you ever caught a lake trout? I never have.
So if you think of the boundary waters, the east side of the boundary waters, the Gunflint end tends to have more lake trout lakes, better lake trout fishing than the Ely side, although there certainly are some. And I have gone up on several occasions and targeted just lake trout, but it really is a different kind of fishing. You're going to be fishing in 50 to 60 feet of water. Typically you're trolling a heavy spoon way down deep, and you'll just be paddling around, hoping to find where the fish are. They're very individual, very solo fish. You don't find them in schools. So it might be, 100 yards, it could be a mile between fish. And so it's much more challenging fishing. I actually use a small portable depth finder that helps me know how deep the water is. It's not very good at finding fish, but at least then I know that I'm in the right water depth. In the spring of the year, this time of year, they're actually going to be in kind of shallow, And there's some people that actually will target lake trout with a fly rod this time of year because you might find them in 10 feet of water or less. But as the summer progresses, they get deeper and deeper and just harder and harder to catch.
Yeah, Tom, someone wants to know if there is a chart that shows the temperatures, different temperatures that each fish prefers.
I'm sure you can find that. I don't know that right off the top of my head. You know, many of these lakes in the summer, they stratify, which means that the warm water is on the top and the very cold water is down below. And there's this layer called the epilimnion right in the middle that separates the two. Trout prefer that colder water, but the deeper you go, the less oxygen there is as well. So there becomes a point where they'll suspend at a 40 or 50 foot level, regardless of how deep the lake is. So again, it's challenging fish. I always tell people, you know, whenever you're going for a fish that you don't know much about or a lake that you don't know much about, you talk to the local bait shop and get some tips from them. They won't tell you their deep secrets, but they might tell you some casual secrets. Did you want to say something?
I mean, I've never personally fished for lake trout, so I don't have any lake trout stories, but that is definitely a bucket list fish of mine, as it says right there. So maybe one day, if I ever get out, would you say the west side of the boundary waters is where they're at?
East side.
East side, so I don't even know where they are.
What lake, Tom? Tell us what lake.
What's that, Lauren?
I said, what lake, Tom? Tell us the lake they're on.
GPS coordinates.
There's many good lakes up there, and I'll refer to this website a lot. But on the DNR's website is a tab called Lake Finder. Lake Finder, one word. Lake Finder. I don't know what the whole URL is, but we've got it on the program here. That tells you for every specific lake what kind of fish are in there. And so if you want to find a lake with lake trout, go in there and poke around on some of the lakes in the boundary waters, and you find the ones that do. Let's move on, Ingrid, and talk a little bit, just a very little bit about panfish. There certainly are panfish in the boundary waters, bluegills, crappie, and perch in particular. You don't tend to hear a lot about them. People have much better pan fishing for the most part in the central part of the state, but there are some up there, and there are some nice fish up there. I think they're a little harder to catch, personally, in my opinion, because there's not the kind of structure that you often need to find them by, that being weeds in particular. But you can catch them every now and then. And I know in some of the lakes I go to, there's actually a strong ice fishing contingent for crappies in some of the lakes up there. So it can be hard to find. They're all good eating, of course. They tend to be in shallow water and near weeds. Next slide, please. So those are the fish that you might be after. Now you're thinking, okay, now I know a little bit about why I ought to fish the boundary waters. I know what kind of fish are up there. What do I need? And this is an area I really want to emphasize. People should not overcomplicate nor overspend, because you do not need really fancy equipment. You don't need expensive equipment. You don't need a lot of equipment to catch fish in the boundary waters. And of course, since you're carrying this all in, you want to be as minimalist as you possibly can. And so we're going to take a little clip here of some of the equipment that I typically bring to the boundary waters. I'm going to switch to a cell phone camera here.
That you might want to bring for fishing in the boundary waters. First and foremost, of course, is a fishing rod. This is a spinning rod. You hold it like this. It's very easy to cast with once you get the knack of it. I've got 4-pound test line on there, which is good for most walleye fishing, but for a beginner, I'd suggest maybe 6-pound test line. That means it'll take 6 pounds of pressure before it breaks. That's a good compromise for big fish as well as smaller fish. I like to bring a little net with. This one folds up so it fits in my Duluth pack better, but it's very good for bringing in those walleyes and those bass, which are can be kind of heavy and hard to bring over the side. We use leeches a lot. This is a little package that you use to keep your leeches in. You tie it to the side of the boat, and it keeps your leeches alive. Very good bait for walleyes. If you are going to keep fish, you may want to consider a stringer. This is a metal stringer. It comes in a plastic fashion as well, which is probably preferable. It's quieter. And you just stick that hook up through the bottom of the jaw of the fish, pull it out its mouth, and then clip it shut like a safety pin. And that keeps the fish on your line, and you attach it to a thwart. A very sharp knife, of course, is critical if you're going to eat fish. I keep a little sharpener along with it to keep that knife sharp. It's important when you're cleaning fish that you have a sharp knife. Dull knives, they say, hurt more people than sharp knives. I fit all my stuff in this size tackle box. There's a lot of junk in there, as you can see, but you don't want to be carrying a big tackle box. You want a small tackle box, so I just stuff the gear in there. Really, for most boundary waters fishing, in my opinion, you can get by with about 4 different kinds of lures. The crankbaits, the Rapala minnow lure is a good one. Jigs are very important for getting down to the bottom where you're going to be fishing for walleyes. Topwater lures, this one floats and makes a lot of noise when you pull it. That's really fun for smallmouth bass. So it makes a bass come up to the top. These are some examples of spoons. These two in particular are good for lake trout. Daredevils in various sizes are good, really good for northerns. If you're going to go fishing with live bait, with say crayfish that you catch or minnows, you may want to get some slip bobbers. These allow you to cast out a long ways and still have your bait set at a deep depth. And then some hooks to go along with that. Now, finding fish, it's important to have a topo map or a lake map like you'll typically have for the boundary waters, and learn to read how these lines indicate depth. In this case, a very popular lake, each of these lines indicates a 10-foot depth. And when you look at it, you see that this place right here is actually a sunken island. So it comes up to about 10 feet from the water surface. Very good spot for walleyes. We look at the ends of points and then these sunken islands for walleyes, maybe back in these bays for smallmouth and northerns, and in a very deep hole if you're looking for lake trout. So very important to have this. I prefer to use a small depth finder. This is a portable depth finder. It runs on D-cell batteries. It doesn't so much tell me where the fish are, but it tells me how deep the water is, which in the boundary waters, it can change from 0 to 15, 20 feet in a matter of a few feet. So this allows me to stay in my preferred depths, which are usually from 5 feet to say 15 feet deep. If you don't have that, just monitor your depth with how far down your jig is or some other weight. So that is pretty much it. Now, the other things that you'll want to have, of course, in your canoe with you when you're fishing is a life jacket, a PFD, personal flotation device. Of course, don't forget your license. And if you're trout fishing, you'll need a trout stamp. You will also want to, maybe have some preserved bait, some minnows that you can buy that are freeze-dried or sometimes salted, and those are good for lake trout fishing deep. And I tend to like to fish with an anchor. Sometimes when you want to stay in the same place, the wind is blowing, I tie a rock onto the end of a 20-foot rope and I drop that down, and that holds me in my spot, and that allows me to fish that spot until I'm satisfied that there's no more fish. So that is just a very basic set of equipment. And with that, you can have a lot of good fun in the boundary waters.
So just a little bit more on anchoring. Fishing out of canoe is different, obviously, than fishing out of a big fishing boat. And of course, first and foremost, you want to be very careful. The person in front has to be conscious of the person behind when you're casting, because I've seen people hook people in the canoe with them. You want to be very careful of that. But especially when there's any kind of a breeze at all, it's very, very hard to control the boat. The person in the stern is always the person who ends up having to control the boat. And so to make fishing fun for both, like I say, I'll use an anchor. And in my case, I'll just find a rock, in shallow water, roughly the size of a football. I'll take my 20-foot rope and I'll tie it on, tight to the rock. And then I will typically tie that to the back of the canoe. I'll tie the anchor to the back of the canoe rather than the front of the canoe. Now, why is that? So think about how the wind is blowing. If I'm anchored from the back, then the wind is at my back and it's pointing my canoe downwind. And so now I can cast with the wind rather than against the wind. And I'm also not having to just fight the wind all the time. So it really is a nice way to fish. You find yourself a nice point, a nice reef, a nice rock pile, anchor on that. You know, and again, especially thinking of walleyes. Walleyes are a school fish. They tend to be where you find one, you'll find more. And so if I'm trolling a Rapala along close to shore and I catch a walleye, I immediately drop the anchor, and then I'll fish there for a while to see if there's more fish there. So it just you know, it's one of those pieces of equipment people don't think about, but being able to anchor really has a lot of value.
Yeah, you can also get an anchor bag. I think, Brad, you mentioned this in the comments. They make anchor bags for canoes and or kayaks that you can fill with sand or rocks. So they're really light to pack. And you can just, again, leave the rocks where you found them.
Yeah, they're very nice. They're like a grocery bag, like a plastic grocery bag, except they're made out of sturdy mesh and have handles on them, so you can put like 3 or 4 small rocks in there, and that'll give you enough weight that'll hold you in place. And it's easier than trying to tie a big rock onto a line.
Mhm.
Lauren, you have a tackle box as well that you take to boundary water. You want to show us that?
I do. Yes, mine is very tiny. I like to pack lights. So mine is just like a little double-sided plano. And it's mainly just weights and hooks. I do have some leaders in there, some swivels, and some jigs. And then if I usually don't take live baits, which is, I mean, unfortunate. I don't have one of those leech bags, but now that I know they exist, I'm gonna have to get one and take live bait. But I will take, like, these are just like fake leeches, basically. Don't work as well as the real deal. But I'll take that. And then I've got my knife here, my fillet knife, and it has a built-in sharpener, which again, I'm kind of a minimalist. Take as little as possible. My leader is just a typical old-fashioned one of these guys, right? And then my pole does not collapse, and I carry my bobber, my slip bobber on my rod, so I don't have to put it doesn't really fit in my tiny little tackle box. But this rod and reel combo, oh, and I'm caught on something in my house here. Here we go. This was like a $35 setup, reel included. I got the rod for $5 used, bought the reel new for 30 bucks, and works great. It's fantastic. So you don't need to spend much, as Tom said.
I would hardly agree. If you're a beginning angler, I'd look for a combo rod and reel, and you could pick up a quite serviceable one for 35 bucks at any of the big sporting goods stores. And I'm actually using one that I bought for my kids probably 20 years ago and still works just fine. So you certainly can spend more. You'll get better quality when you buy better gear, but for the most part, especially when you're starting, starter kit is really all you need. Now, Sam is kind of a gear junkie. So Sam,
I was gonna say if you don't buy the nice equipment, then you also have more excuses, because you can blame it on the cheap equipment, you know, the cheap line broke or the cheap reel. Yeah, no, there was definitely a period.
So Tom and Sam, you're having a little connectivity issue. Did we lose you?
Seems we may have temporarily lost them.
Oh, good. Now the weight of this relies on me. Welcome to the Female Fishing Hour. No, just joking. Well, we'll let them reconnect here. And maybe when Sam gets back on, he can talk about his gear. But yeah, if you guys have tips, if you've fished in the boundary waters before, or have a piece of equipment that maybe you think like, man, you always go to the boundary waters with, we'd love to hear about that too. I don't really take a net. It's another thing to carry. There is obviously a detriment to not taking a net with you. Getting the fish in the boat is one of them. And then once you have the fish in the boat, that can be an issue too, depending on the size of the fish, the aggressiveness of the fish. If it's flopping around, you know, a canoe is not a glass boat. So I know Tom specifically, him and I were talking about this prior to this, and he said he'll keep the fish in the net over the side of the canoe, you know, to get the hook out. Another thing, another piece of equipment that we didn't talk about was the needle nose pliers. That's something that I don't have here with me now, but I will take something like that with me because a lot of times your fish can swallow the hook and you need something to get in there, especially if it's a walleye with sharp teeth. You need a tool to get in order to remove your hook properly. And then you can put your fish on the leader and then back in the water. You want to keep your fish alive as long as possible. So let's say I might be jumping ahead here, but as long as we're waiting for Sam and Tom to come back, I don't think they've come back yet.
They are, it looks like they're working on it.
Ah.
Although it's a little choppy still.
Okay, well,
oh.
I'll keep going.
Yeah, speak up when you guys feel like your connectivity is such that you can.
We're back. I think we're back.
Hey.
There you go, Sam. So I just went over talking about a needle nose pliers and talking about keeping fish alive until you eat them.
Okay.
But so, what you were talking about your gear.
Yeah, well, I was just saying that, it's easy to get caught up. There's so much out there and so much money to be spent that it's very easy to overspend and to overshop. And so I think simplifying it is a very, very, very good piece of advice.
It's often said that tackle manufacturers really are intending to catch fishermen and anglers, not fish. So Lauren, yes, a needle nose plier is a good piece of equipment to have if you're going to be fishing for those toothy fish like northerns and walleye in particular. So
yeah, and Robert says taking a diagonal pliers that can also cut a hook if you hook a person. There is a trick. There's YouTube videos of this. You can actually take a piece, like a strip of fabric or a piece of fishing line or a ribbon or something, and use that to gently remove a hook. You have to like push it down back. I can't do it without, there's YouTube tutorials on it though. If you watch that before you go, especially with new timer, like kids in particular, it's a real easy way to remove a hook versus having to cut it and go into the emergency room.
Yeah, in fact, if you're gonna fish with a kid, what you might even consider is flattening that barb. Take up pliers and just push that barb down, because that's why people can't get that hook out if they get it in their skin, is because the barb's in there. Also makes taking the fish off easier, but it also does allow fish to flop off if they're not well hooked. All right, well, as long as we got connectivity here, let's go on to the next slide. So now you've got the fish in mind. Now you've got the equipment. I want to mention. I guess I covered those things. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So where and when? Okay, so now you know the species that are out there, you know the kind of equipment you need. Now you're saying, okay, well, where do I go to catch fish? And let's go to the next slide. So I want to cover it from two angles. The first is you're going to the boundary waters. Where do I go to catch a fish? And so from the big picture, from the macro level, a lot of it depends on the species. So I already mentioned that, lake trout are only going to be found in certain lakes. And so if you're fishing on a lake without lake trout, you're never going to catch one. So you gotta know which fish are going to be in the lakes that you're at. And again, that DNR Lake Finder is a really good place to find out what fish are in there. People tend to go to the boundary waters under sort of two different approaches. One is, I'm going to take this route. I'm going to take the Lake 1 route. I'm going to go in this circle. I'm going to fish in these lakes. So what can I catch? So people on that kind of a trip are taking advantage of the fish that are there. And that's great. And again, that Lake Finder app is a really good tool to know what's in there to fish for, and then you can equip yourself appropriately. But once you've got a little bit of a handle on it, you say, okay, now I want to go for lake trout, or now I want to go for walleye. So now you design your trip to catch the fish that you're interested in. When you do that, then you can really get into some really good fishing experiences. That's, I say we tend to base camp. That's because that's what we do. We want to go catch walleyes. I know I can catch my 5 walleyes in the spring. So we'll go up and base camp and fish off the points that we've fished for many, many years. So the macro level, know where you're going, look for the species that are there, and then equip yourself appropriately. But then once you're on a lake, okay, so now I'm on a lake, so now I'm on Snowbank Lake, now I'm on Lake One, where do I fish? Again, it's going to be dependent on the species, you know, as we talked about before, that, you know, some species are deep, some species are shallow. They almost all are looking for some kind of structure. So it's important that this is when you pull out your map, your lake map, which, like the Mackenzie maps, they will show lake depths. And you look for what's called structure. This is underwater land forms. So you know how you'll have a big cliff dropping down to the water's edge. Well, in most cases, if you have a big cliff coming down the water's edge, that cliff probably continues underwater. Same thing with a point. When you have a point coming out into a lake, chances are that point continues underwater. Both of those create structure. And so structures can be points, they can be sunken islands, they can be what we call a reef, which is kind of shallow water that comes up out of nowhere. And those structures are the places where fish tend to head out. So you look for that kind of structure, fish around that structure, try different depths, and you know, see where the fish are at. There's also, you have to be conscious of the wind. You know, I mentioned how I will anchor in order to fish in one spot, but fish also respond to the wind. So if the wind has been out of the, say, the northwest for a couple of days, we have found that the downwind side of the lake will tend to have fish that are feeding. And our hypothesis is that when the wind is blowing the same direction for some period of time, it's blowing all of the bait, all of the stuff that fell out of the trees, all the bugs and all of the invertebrates that fell out of the trees are blowing into that far shore, and the fish pick up on that. And so sometimes you have to be in the wind to take advantage of that in a small bay on the downwind side of the lake. And finally, I typically start shallow and work my way into deeper water. So if I'm targeting walleyes, we'll be up in 2 weeks fishing out of Ely. We'll start fishing in probably 7 feet of water for walleyes, and we'll gradually work our way deeper until we find where they're at. They'll typically, in the case of walleyes, they'll typically school up at a particular depth. So between 10 and 12 feet, we'll come find them at. And when you find them there, then you stay there, and that's where you fish. And even if you go to a different point on the lake, chances are that's where you're going to find them. So just, you know, specifically to those species, as I mentioned, with walleye, 6 to 15 deep in the spring and early summer. By structure is a good place to look. Smallmouth, typically less than 10 feet deep, is my experience. And in rocky areas, they do like to hang around rocks. Northern, less than 15 feet deep. Again, these are big predator fish, so they're looking for smaller fish, which tend to hide near vegetation. And then in lake trout, it's usually, you know, after spring, after about June 1, they'll be in water that's, you know, 20 to 40 feet deep. This time of year, you might find them shallower. Now, Sam is a big bass guy, so I'm going to ask Sam, where would you go for those smallmouth?
The nice thing about bass fishing is I think it's relatively easy because you can just beat the bank. I mean, I just almost exclusively fish shorelines, and like you said, look for structure. So whether that be wood that is leaning over into the water, weeds, anytime there's a sharp change in depth, if you're lucky enough to have a depth finder, that's a good sign that there could be fish there. And then I think just the biggest thing is when you catch your first fish, it can be exciting and you can like not think about what just happened. But I think it's really important to think like, where am I right now? How deep am I? Where did that, where did that fish bite? What kind of structure were they relating to? All of that. And then just try and replicate that over and over. And that's how I feel like you can try and find some success, put together a pattern.
I suspect that's true with walleyes. Is that what you do in Vermilion there, Lauren?
Oh yeah. A lot of times we'll put a buoy down too. I mean, I obviously not do that in the boundary waters, but outside the boundary waters, yeah, like you can get these little floaty buoys with little baby anchors on them, and you mark your spot. Of course, then you're marking it for the rest of the lake. So that's something to look for. If you don't know where to fish, look for other people's buoys on different lakes.
We have actually used those quite a bit in the boundary waters. A little fluorescent orange, looks like a barbell with a string on it. And especially for walleye, you catch a walleye, you drop it there because, like I say, they're schooling fish. And so if you catch one, chances are you'll catch more there.
You can also use like a milk jug too. You can make your own. Just attach some string to it and tie a rock at the end.
You bet, yeah. All right, next slide, please. And so that's roughly where to go. Now, when do you go? Well, we'd all like the fish to be jumping in our boat all the time. In this case, you don't want that. That's invasive Asian carp. You don't want that, but that's every angler's dream is to have fish jumping in their boat. You know, anytime is a good time to fish. The fish are most active typically in the spring and the fall. Spring because it's spawning season and that requires a lot of energy, so they're eating a lot. Summer they get a little lethargic, they go deep because the water's getting warm. But in the fall, as things start cooling off and they have to start fattening up for the winter, they'll put on another feeding frenzy. So spring and fall tend to be the best times. It can be very challenging in the middle of summer, July, to go find fish. The only thing I can suggest then is go deep, try early and late, and check with your bait shop. During the day, you know, what time of day? Morning and evening, low light tends to be the best. You know, it's really a good practice. I think go fishing in the morning, come back, have a little breakfast, take a nap, and then go back out in the afternoon. You'd be most productive those times of day, and you're taking best advantage of the hours. But as I say, really any time is a good time to fish. Now, Sam likes to get up very early. I've never seen a kid get up this early to go fishing, but I like to sleep till 6:30. I'll get up and Sam will already have been out there fishing for an hour.
Part of that, I think, had to do with the sleeping conditions. I was mostly lying awake at night, waiting for the first bit of sunlight, so it was excusable to get up and go. I never camped growing up, and so that first Boundary Waters trip, didn't get much sleep. So I was like, well, I might as well be fishing. So I was up at 5 every morning.
Next year, we'll give you a sleeping pad.
There you go.
That'll help.
There you go.
All right, Tom, we've got about 10 minutes left here. So
Okay,
let's talk about cleaning and cooking.
Yeah. Please, next slide. Cleaning and cooking. Fish fry. Lauren says fish fry for Friday. So just a little bit of etiquette, and this is actually some of the rules as well. You should only keep what you can eat or bring back. And again, within the regulations for the daily limit and so on. There's no sense keeping 6 fish if you're going to only be able to eat 3, and then you've got 3 that you're wondering what to do with. So just keep the ones you're going to eat. If you are going to bring some back, make sure you bring some ice, because it's going to take you a while to get back to your car and you don't want those fish to spoil. It's preferable to keep the smaller fish instead of the big ones. If you get a 30-inch walleye, you should let that thing go. That is a spawning fish. That is a breeding fish. That's going to make a lot of young walleyes in the future. You're far better off eating a 14 or 16-inch walleye and leaving those big ones go. And this is, again, per the rules. You must clean your fish away from shore, and you must throw the guts and the skin in the woods away from camp. The Forest Service is very deliberately trying to avoid having seagulls and even eagles becoming parasites on, looking for people and hanging out. So make sure you stash those guts back in the woods and bury them if you can. Next slide. I should mention that if you're going to keep a fish and bring it back off the lake, you need to keep a 1-inch square patch of scales, skin and scales on that fillet. It has to be identifiable as to the species if you're going to transport it. So make sure that you keep that patch of skin on.
Yeah, Tom, I'd also add, it's really important to check, because you brought this up offline, about the slot. And the slots are the basically designated length of fish that you're allowed to keep. And they change based on season and as well as lake and species. Yep. So you really need to grab one of the DNR puts out a regs book. They're free when you get your fishing license. Grab one of those and make sure you're up to date. Now, it's not going to have every lake on it. So, Tom, where do you go to find out for your favorite Boundary Waters lake what the regs are?
So because we typically go to the same lakes, we'll look it up once, and then that's all you need to know. So I can look up that specific lake. I can look up Lake 1. I can say, okay, I can have 6 walleyes, but only, 4 of them can be 16 inches and only 1 over 20, or whatever the rule might be. So it's important to know for that specific lake. If you're going to keep fish, it's almost always safe to say you can keep 2 or 3 fish to eat. without having to worry about it. But if you're gonna really go fishing for your limit, you really have to know what the limit is.
And Tom, while you get in here talking about, you have to keep the patch on. Your next one is keeping, if the fish is alive, what's the most humane way to kill the fish before you fillet it?
Well, so that goes to my next bullet there. I like to keep my fish alive till I'm going to clean them. And if you try cleaning a fish while it's alive, well, I don't know how the fish feels that, but I do know that they do not sit still. And so my preference is to put that fish on its belly and cut its head right off, and then I'll fillet it from that. So that's about as instantaneous and as humane as I think you can be. Some people will wrap them hard on the back of the head with a stick or a rock. And I've seen people just cut the veins at the bottom of the neck as well to also bleed them out. Any of those is fine. I think it's far more humane to kill a fish like that than it is to just have it on your stringer and die from being on your stringer all day. So yeah, I think make sure you keep it alive as long as you can to keep it fresh. Kill it quickly when it's time to fillet. Then when it is time to fillet, a sharp knife is essential. I think many people, especially with the new large bladed paddles, use the back of their paddle for a fillet surface. You want a nice flat surface, and you get that wedged on top of a big rock. That's a very nice surface. And just be very, very careful, because that's a sharp knife. I always bring some gallon Ziploc bags to put the fish fillets in, wash them off, put them in there, and then again, put the guts back in the woods. There's 3 YouTube videos on how to clean different fish. If you've never cleaned a fish, by all means, take a look at some of those. It's not that hard. After you've done it a couple of times, it goes pretty quickly. Next slide. And once you have cleaned them, now is the fun part. Now you get to eat them. And that's a great shot of fish frying at a campsite there. Virtually every fish that you catch, you can eat. You don't have to worry about, it being really awful tasting or poison or anything like that. But each fish is different. And so, walleye, king of the fish in Minnesota, it's one of the best eating. Perch are great eating. Northern can be very good if you get the Y bones out. Trout, people typically don't fry trout. They'll often wrap it up in tin foil, put some butter and some lemon in there, put it on the coals and bake it for 20 minutes. It's outstanding. So any fish you catch, you can eat. In order to be prepared for that, now never count on having a fish meal, because the day that you are dependent upon a fish meal is the day you'll never catch a fish. But have some stuff with you to cook some fish if you do catch them. So I recommend peanut oil. Peanut oil versus vegetable oil has a much higher smoking temperature, so it gets very, very hot, and you want it to be sizzling hot before you drop the fillets in there. There's a product called Shore Lunch. It's a box of floury material that's relatively inexpensive. It's a pre-made breading. You take your fillets, you pat them dry, you dip them in the Shore Lunch, you drop them in that hot peanut oil, and cook them for 5-10 minutes, and it'll be just outstanding. It'll be some of the best food you've ever eaten. We throw in a little lemon or tartar sauce or cocktail sauce and some salt and pepper, and you can have just one of the best meals of your life sitting right on the side of the lake.
There you go.
And Sam, what did we have last year?
We had walleye and salad and wild rice pancakes. We had a lot of good meals. One thing I like to do with walleye is if you just buy a can of soup, whether it be New England clam chowder or even minestrone, any kind of soup, and you catch fish, you chunk the fish up and just cook it in the soup, it just makes it out of this world. And then if you don't catch fish, you still have soup.
Fish chowder.
Yeah.
Lauren, you're the one who suggested fish pancakes there, so you're going to have to explain that.
That's a little.
I mean, if you're doing a savory breakfast, if you've got eggs and things like that, I would just mash up some fish. No, I've never done fish pancakes. That was a joke. But I could see it being good. I could see a way to make it happen.
All right.
Challenge accepted, Tom.
We want to see pictures of that.
Okay.
Next slide. So there's a ton of information out there. So again, go to the DNR's website, mndnr.gov, and you'll find all kinds of information about different fish species, the rules and regulations, information on how to catch them and things like that. They even offer classes on fishing. So you can find a lot on the DNR website. They got the lake finder on there that tells you the species that are out there. If you're so inclined, there is an app that goes on your smartphone that is a digital map of each lake that shows the depths, and it's GPS enabled, so it will show where you are on that lake. I found this to be very useful for identifying, how to get to a sunken island, for instance. And it works even when you don't have cell coverage, because you can pre-download the maps and the GPS works whether you have cell coverage or not. Very handy tool, relatively inexpensive. Lots of good books. Michael Furtman out of Duluth has written a couple of seminal books on fishing, and the BWCA just came out with an update on that. It's a really great source that will also tell you, for instance, where to go for lake trout. And then last but not least, make sure you tie your lures on right. Do not use a granny knot or what you would use to tie your shoe with on a fishing knot. That will break. Special knots to use to prevent that line from parting at your hook. Important to at least know one so you can make sure that your fish stays on the end of the line once you hook it.
Yeah, I'd say pick one, memorize it, and get good at it, because nothing is worse than losing a fish to faulty equipment.
It's always the big ones.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Next slide. I think that might be it. Lauren, tell us your best story.
Oh, best story. I mean, mine involves fishing for a fishing rod. So I'll try and make this quick. My dad had gotten his brand new fishing rod, brand new reel, and we were out fishing, secret place on Secret Lake. And I had it. He was in the back with the trolling motor, the remote control on it. My sister was in the boat. So all three of us are fishing. And my dad had the remote for the trolling motor upside down. So he was operating it incorrectly, backwards, right? And I'm in the nose of the boat, and we're about to crash into shore, which is a giant rock, basically. And I love this boat. I probably use this boat more than anyone in my family. And I panic and I drop my rod, or my dad's brand new rod, into the lake. It goes over the side of the boat, and I, grab the side of the boat and push off the rock. So I managed to save the boat and the trolling motor. But my dad's really bummed. He's just really bummed about, and I can understand why, but a boat's way more expensive. I think I made the right call. And so we went back to try and find something to drag the bottom of this lake with. We got this huge, I don't even know, close to a 15-foot pole with a giant hook on the end. Don't know what it was for, really don't. And so we're going back and forth, dragging the bottom of this lake. We're about 10 feet deep. And my sister is dragging for it, and we make all these passes. And finally, my dad's like, okay, he's just kind of accepted defeat. And he's like, let's just do one more pass. We do one more pass. My sister picks it up, and there's the fishing rod on the end of this hook. So we got really lucky.
There you go.
And he still has it. So yeah. What about you guys?
Well worth recovering.
I don't know if I have anything that crazy. I was thinking earlier when we were talking about getting hooks out of arms. There was a time when I was fishing with my dad, and I was 12, and I put the trouble of a jerkbait so deep in his arm. I'll never forget it. It was so bad and so painful.
You won't forget it either. But
Yeah, probably not.
I once had some small walleyes hanging off the canoe on a stringer, and heard a bunch of noise, and I looked down there, and here was a loon trying to take the walleyes off the stringer, and I had to almost jump up and down to scare that thing away. It was quite an amazing experience. So, well, I see there's a bunch of questions. Should we try and answer some questions?
Yeah. So one of the big questions is, if we're going to be posting this, where can I find the links? We're going to be turning this, we're going to do a blog post where you can find a recorded version of this webinar. In that blog post, we will also have the links. So stay tuned for that. Let's see. We've got someone asking us, what dates do we consider summer? Which I think is a fair question in the boundary waters. Water temperature can actually be a life or death situation up there.
Yeah, it's obviously it changes from year to year, but I generally think of July to the middle of August. It usually, even through the end of June, water's still warming up, and the fish are still pretty receptive. Maybe that last week of June to the second week of August is really when it gets warm, and that'll, fish are done spawning, they're lethargic, they're going down deep, harder to catch. So I'd say, yeah, if you're gonna go for fishing, I would absolutely focus on late May, early June, maybe late August into even early October.
Yeah, and someone else wants to know, kind of going back to the steel leader question. Would a steel leader discourage walleye from biting, you think?
You know,
I don't know. I would say I've had some experiences where I think that's the case. They do make heavy duty fluorocarbon leaders. That's a potential alternative. So it'd be translucent as well. But even that, I think sometimes when walleye can be finicky, you don't want to put too much down there. Too many swivels, too much metal, anything making a bunch of noise definitely can spook the fish. And I think, like you said, walleye, they're not like northern. They don't slam the bait head first and engulf it. They really kind of nibble on it. So you don't necessarily need that. If you are paying attention, you don't really need that leader because you set the hook right away.
Yeah.
Should be good.
I would agree. I think with walleyes in particular, since the teeth aren't generally a problem, I think the less is better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like that's pretty much all our questions. One person had asked, what is shore lunch? And that is, as Tom had said, that's a boxed brand. It's a breading that you use for your fish. But it can also mean, hey, let's go have lunch on shore. So
No, so shore lunch is a pre-made product, but I've
Yeah.
had just as good of experience with Bisquick and cornmeal. Mix them together and use that as your breading, and that's quite good as well.
I'd say shore lunch is the way to go. I think
Yeah.
shore lunch is incredible.
Tom, I have a question for you. You mentioned keeping the fish on ice. Where do you get ice in the boundary waters?
Well, you have to bring it in, of
I know.
course. Bring your ice in, and if you're going to be in more than 2 days, it's almost impossible to keep it frozen that long. We'll typically do 2-night trips, and my pals will bring a block of ice, and with very good soft-sided coolers, they are able to keep that for the 3rd day. But it's a real challenge.
Is there any way you could smoke fish above your fire somehow? MacGyver some little thing and preserve it that way? I mean, it sounds very intense.
I'm sure you could, but there's YouTube videos on it.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are YouTube videos, like what you could, like a primitive smoked fish
Yeah.
recipe, and something will come up.
Yeah.
Well, we are.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
So,
What were you saying, Tom?
Obviously, you have to be really committed to go to that effort, but
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
probably could.
Well, we're 6 minutes over, so I think unless anyone has any other questions, thank you guys so much.
I have a
Oh wait,
question.
we do have more questions. All right, does lure color make a difference? I would say seasonally, yes. Sam?
I think that's a hot topic. Some people say yes, some people say no. I definitely think, being a bass fisherman, I think yes. And I think that, like, I've had days where I'm throwing a green pumpkin colored worm all day, don't catch fish, switch to a white worm and just start catching fish. I think not necessarily difference between like blue and green, but difference between light and dark. Try some light colors. If it's not working, try some darker colors. Water clarity is part of that too, but
Yeah, I would agree. I think the dark versus light is a consideration. When you're fishing the boundary waters, a lot of those waters are very tainted. They're tannin stained, and so they're very dark. So if you get below, say, 6 feet, 7 feet deep, you really can't make out much for color differences, but you probably still can between dark and light. So I'd say try variety. If you're not catching fish, try variety. If you are catching fish, then I wouldn't change.
yeah.
There's also combo platters like this. This happens to be my very favorite color combination. Like,
Marabou? Is that marabou jig or whatever? Is that what it's called?
yes, it is. Yeah. So it's definitely it's my bigger one on hand, but I tend to stick with either this color combo, or I do like something really bright in case I love the day glow yellow things.
Yeah, chartreuse can be really good because it stands out, especially in that stained water.
Yeah, and even hooks. I like to use really bright colored hooks. So can you see that? Yeah, I have pretty much all neon hooks. So
Oh wow.
that's I'm a Gamakatsu fan myself. So I like a nice leech on a nice bright hook is what I like. All right. Any other questions, Ingrid? Oh, fly fishing. We got some more coming in. Any advice for fly fishing?
Well, it'd be very generic. I mean, if I wanted to go fly fishing in boundary waters, I'd probably go for smallmouth. Walleye tend to be deeper. They're a little harder to get the bait down there. You certainly can with northerns too. They're shallow fish. I think smallmouth fishing with little poppers is probably one of the funnest things you can do. A little popper, it's got a little cork head on it, and then it's got tail feathers on the tail, and you just kind of pop it across the top of the water, and the fish just slam it.
And they explode.
It's just crazy. And a fly rod, a fly rod is like 9 feet long. It's got a lot of play in it, so you really get a lot of action out of it, and it can be a lot of fun. I think I don't think you can beat that kind of fishing. I think you could probably find smallmouth in almost any lake in the boundary waters. And if I was going to go fly fishing, that's the way I would plan it.
Yeah, Tom and Sam, someone else wants to, if we talked about non-lead lures, and we did, it was in the video, but do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
So it's non-lead. So
oh, sorry, you're right. I was reading it lead.
with lead, both in sinkers and say in jig heads, because loons can pick them up, and if they pick up one jig head or they pick up 2 small sinkers, it can be toxic to them. The alternatives have been very, very slow to develop. There is an alternative out there. It's called tungsten now, and it's becoming more widely available. It's heavy, dense like lead, but it's not non-toxic. And so if the fish pick it, or excuse me, if the birds pick it up, it won't harm them. And in fact, those jigs that were shown in that video were tungsten jigs. So those are the non-toxic. Sometimes you have to look for them because they aren't as broadly available as lead, but especially as they're becoming more and more available, the prices are coming down, and it becomes a very viable option.
All right. I think that's all we have. We're good to go. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope you liked it. And yeah, Tom, take us out.
And important thing is just to get out and fish and have fun.
And take your girls fishing.
Take your girl fishing. That's right. We're taking our girl fishing. It happens to be the same girl.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Happy fishing, opener.